At exactly 3:17 a.m., I was jerked awake by a chaotic mix of blaring sirens, screeching tires, and a rapid-fire dance of red and blue lights reflecting off my bedroom walls. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. I stumbled to my window, confused and disoriented, only to witness a scene that looked ripped straight from a high-budget action movie. Heavily armed officers were moving with surgical precision, radios crackling as they barked commands. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop, no. What shattered me was the sight of the empty space in front of my house. My Jeep, the very one I'd securely locked and parked exactly where the local law enforcement had told me to, was gone. In its place stood a single neon orange cone with a sticky note attached. Just 5 words scrawled across it in sloppy handwriting: code violation. HOA confiscated. I stared at that ridiculous message for several seconds before my brain caught up to the madness. My Jeep, my locked Jeep, had been towed not by thieves or carjackers, but by the Homeowners Association. And the person behind it, none other than Linda Farthington, better known by every soul in the Willow Creek Estates as Karen Supreme. She had no idea, none whatsoever, that by snipping that lock and towing my vehicle, she hadn't just committed an epic overreach of HOA power. She had completely sabotaged a months-long undercover federal sting. Because what Karen didn't know, and what she absolutely should have asked about before flexing her authority, was that the Jeep wasn't just mine. It was wired to the teeth with surveillance gear, high-grade federal-grade equipment. It had been a key part of an active investigation into a drug trafficking ring that had wormed its way into our peaceful suburban community. And now, thanks to Karen's ego and her bolt cutters, the whole operation was in ruins, and a team of very angry federal agents was standing on my doorstep asking me to explain how a neighborhood busybody had single-handedly hijacked a government surveillance vehicle. Let me back up. Moving into Willow Creek Estates was supposed to be the beginning of a quieter, simpler life. After years bouncing around the country during my military career, and then more years chasing contract work from city to city, I was done with chaos. I wanted stillness. I wanted a place where I could grill on weekends, walk my dog without traffic screaming past, and finally rebuild that half-scrapped motorcycle gathering dust in storage. At first, it felt like I'd found exactly that. Neighbors waved when they saw you. Kids chalked up the sidewalks. Everything smelled like fresh-cut lawns, fire pits, and suburban comfort. And then came Linda. You know the type. The kind of HOA president who doesn't just enforce the rules, she becomes them. She didn't merely monitor lawns. She measured them. She didn't give reminders, she gave citations. The woman ran her own version of suburban martial law, armed with clipboards, passive-aggressive newsletters, and an endless appetite for enforcing conformity. She hated my Jeep from day one. I remember it clearly. She walked past, spotted it parked in my driveway, a big, black, military-grade beast with reinforced bumpers and matte blackout plating, and froze. Her lips pressed together so tightly they nearly disappeared. She looked at it like it was a threat to her HOA-ordered reality. That, she muttered, doesn't belong in this neighborhood. I laughed it off, tried to be civil. I explained it wasn't just a cool ride, it was part of my consulting work with law enforcement. She gave me the kind of smirk reserved for toddlers and conspiracy theorists and said, "Nice story, soldier. Boy, try a Honda next time." From that moment on, she made it her mission to get rid of the Jeep. Every week, I'd get fresh letters from the HOA citing things like non-conforming vehicle aesthetics, unauthorized tactical modifications, and my personal favorite, visual intimidation. I never knew a parked car could commit psychological warfare, but Karen didn't know because she never bothered to ask that the Jeep had been selected specifically because of its intimidating appearance. You see, a federal task force had approached me just a few months earlier. They were targeting a drug trafficking network that was operating just below the surface of our clean-cut community. They needed a discreet surveillance node that wouldn't draw attention but could hold high-end recording gear, GPS tracking, and long-range monitoring tech. They chose my Jeep. It blended in as a tough, rugged vehicle. No one would question why it was parked there. And because it was mine, they didn't need to file for placement. All I had to do was park it in the same spot, rotate the tires a little every few days, and never move it without calling the team. First, I was working until Karen decided she'd had enough. The presence of the Jeep was, to her, a personal insult, a stain on the HOA's aesthetic purity. She filed complaints, 5, to be exact, each one more urgent than the last, despite me explaining repeatedly that the vehicle was not abandoned, not illegal, and very much on purpose. She insisted it was her right to act. And one day, she did. I'd stepped out for groceries barely an hour, and in that time, Karen made her move first. She grabbed a pair of bolt cutters, marched up to my Jeep in broad daylight, and snapped the heavy-duty lock right off the front wheel. Then she called in a tow truck, not even an official city one, some sketchy outfit without markings that clearly didn't ask too many questions. Luckily for me, and unluckily for her, my neighbor Rick had a front row seat. Rick, a porch sit, lawn-watching retiree with a love of cold beer and surveillance tech, had his Ring camera rolling the whole time. The footage, Karen smiling into the lens, bolt cutters in hand, muttering finally, "One less eyesore." By the time I returned, the Jeep was gone. At first I panicked, thinking it was stolen, but then I saw the cone, the note, and I knew. I pounded on Karen's door. She didn't answer. Instead, she sent me a smug little email saying the HOA had relocated my non-compliant vehicle for the sake of community peace. I couldn't even laugh. I was too busy dialing the task force. 30 minutes later, they were at my house. I showed them the footage. I told them everything. And the moment Officer Melendez saw the lock-cutting clip, his face turned white. "She cut the lock," he repeated, voice cold. "Yes," I said, "then had it towed. Without authorization." I nodded. He looked at his partner, cursed under his breath, and said the words that sent chills down my spine. "That's tampering with federal surveillance equipment." The sting operation was over. They had to pull the plug immediately. The suspects would be spooked, maybe gone. A months-long effort compromised because an HOA president didn't like the look of a parked Jeep. But the worst part, we didn't know where she'd taken it. It wasn't in any official lot. The company she used wasn't traceable. For all we knew, it was sitting in a warehouse somewhere. Surveillance drive wide open, with classified tech exposed to the elements. All we had was the ring footage, the note, and the knowledge that Karen had no clue what kind of fire she'd just lit. And as I stood there that night, watching flashing lights again fill my street, but this time with federal agents scrambling and suspects on the run, I realized the real story wasn't about a stolen Jeep. It was about the moment the HOA crossed the line, and what happened when the government came knocking. By the time the sun rose, the morning after the task force raid, the entire neighborhood buzzed with confusion, whispers, and barely contained curiosity. Residents peeked through blinds and gossiped over hedges about the flashing lights, the armed officers, and most of all the missing Jeep. But while everyone else tried to fill in blanks with speculation, I was already sitting in the passenger seat of Officer Melendez's SUV, speeding down a stretch of back roads I'd never traveled. Before we didn't speak. The mood was too tense, too heavy with the weight of what we might find. My vehicle had been a critical part of a federal surveillance operation. Its disappearance didn't just jeopardize evidence, it risked blowing an entire months-long sting. And now, Melendez said they'd located it. When we finally pulled up to a rusted chain-link gate near an old maintenance shed, something technically on HOA land, I was shocked. Melendez stepped out, looked at the open padlock dangling from the latch, and muttered, "Unbelievable." Inside the gate was a graveyard of confiscated cars, not junkers or abandoned rust buckets, perfectly drivable newer models, many with tickets stuffed under their wipers or HOA citations taped to the windows. And there, parked crooked under a sagging tarp like some discarded toy, was my Jeep, filthy, scratched, the lock gone, and were tampered with. The passenger door was slightly ajar, the driver's mirror cracked, but the real gut punch, the secure black case under the rear floorboard where the encrypted drive and surveillance feed had been, was hanging open, empty. I didn't even realize I'd stopped breathing until Melendez swore under his breath and started snapping photos. "This isn't an impound lot," he said, kicking aside a cone. "This is a rogue operation. She's running a black market tow yard out of an HOA utility lot." And just like that, all the carefully stacked dominoes started to fall. The backup arrived within the hour. Unmarked cars, evidence techs, plainclothes investigators. They cordoned off the area, documented everything, and treated my Jeep like a crime scene, which, by now it basically was. And then, as if summoned by the chaos, Karen Farthington appeared, walked in wearing her signature crimson blazer and a pair of wedge heels, wildly inappropriate for gravel terrain, humming like she'd just returned from a yoga retreat. "Oh good," she said sweetly, clasping her hands. "You found it." Melendez stepped toward her like a storm cloud with a badge. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." Karen blinked, startled. "Excuse me, I am the HOA president. I was just trying to maintain neighborhood standards." "That Jeep was that Jeep," Melendez cut in, his voice sharp, "was federal property. You removed it without authorization, destroyed surveillance equipment, and interfered in an active operation." There was a beat of silence where even the birds stopped chirping. Karen, unfazed, waved him off. "Oh please." It was chained up and sitting in the same spot for days. Looked abandoned. I followed the bylaws. "You cut a government lock," I added, stepping forward. "You had it dragged off by a tow truck with no license plates. You dumped it here like it was junk." Karen's smile finally cracked. She opened her mouth to speak, but Melendez had already signaled to another officer, "Take her for questioning." "I did what any responsible community leader would do," she shouted as they led her away. "I was protecting the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. That vehicle was a threat to harmony." The words sounded absurd even to her, and yet she kept going, her voice rising with every step. By noon, the damage was clear. The sting operation had been compromised. The surveillance drive was missing, or wiped. The suspects, several known affiliates of a local trafficking ring, had vanished overnight, clearly tipped off somehow. And Karen, she was at the center of it all. The feds had names for this kind of behavior: obstruction of justice, tampering with federal equipment, unauthorized seizure of property. But no charge could truly encapsulate how outrageous this all was, how one woman's pathological obsession with neighborhood order had derailed a months-long multi-agency investigation. Later that evening, I got a call from Detective Sasha Lynn, the woman heading the task force. She sounded calm, but I could tell by the edge in her voice that the situation was anything but. "Do you still have the ring footage?" she asked. "I do, and my neighbor Rick does too." "Good," she said. "We're going to need every second of it." Rick had outdone himself. Not only did he have the entire tow job captured on his porch cam, but he'd also compiled screenshots of Karen's HOA rants, Facebook posts, and a clip of her saying in her own voice, "I don't care who owns it, that thing's not staying on my street." He handed everything over with the theatrical flair of a man presenting damning evidence in a true crime documentary. "She's been at this for years," Rick said, grinning. "Ticketing garden gnomes, measuring mailbox heights, finding someone for wind chimes but stealing a government Jeep. That's her swan song." What none of us knew at the time was that Karen hadn't just towed the Jeep. She had, for years, maintained an unofficial HOA vehicle disposal program. If a car sat too long for her liking, whether it violated any real rule or not, she would mark it for aesthetic mitigation. Sometimes it was a friend's tow truck, sometimes a private storage lot, sometimes here, in this overgrown yard behind a shed no one remembered approving. No board votes. No formal documentation. Just Karen and her clipboard playing judge, jury, and impounder-in-chief. Detective Lynn sent a formal request for HOA records and began interviewing other board members. Unsurprisingly, most had no idea Karen was doing any of this. One even looked physically ill when he learned about the lot. "She told us those cars were being taken to the city yard," he mumbled. "She lied," Lynn replied flatly. "And now she's facing multiple felonies." That night, word spread fast. Neighbors who once whispered complaints about Karen now spoke openly. Stories poured in, threats of fines. HOA meetings turned into shouting matches. The time she removed someone's porch swing because it was non-compliant with visual tone. And now she was sitting in an interrogation room facing a mountain of federal scrutiny. The next morning, every mailbox in the neighborhood had a notice. Emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance Friday, 6:30 p.m. Community Center, TOPIC. Clarification on recent events and safety concerns. Clarification. Seriously, Karen wasn't apologizing. She was spinning. I stared at the notice in disbelief. She was actually going to try to defend herself. I showed it to Rick, who was already sipping iced tea on his porch. He raised his eyebrows. "She's bringing popcorn to her own roast," he said. "This is gonna be good." And it was, just not for Karen. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Friday night wasn't going to be an HOA meeting. It was going to be her trial. By the time Friday evening rolled around, the atmosphere in Willow Creek Estates felt like the countdown to a courtroom showdown. People filed into the HOA community center with more buzz than any potluck or block party had ever stirred. There were folding chairs arranged in neat rows, though no one really sat. Some residents brought their kids, others brought popcorn. A few reporters hovered near the door with cameras slung over their shoulders, trying to blend in. They didn't dot at the front of the room. A long table stretched across a raised platform where the HOA board usually sat, though that night they looked more like a firing squad facing execution. Greg, the vice president, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, already sweating through his collar, and then she arrived, Karen Farthington, in her signature fire engine red blazer, heels clicking on the tile like a metronome of doom. She walked in like she was headlining a TED Talk, clipboard in hand. Expression a picture of defiant poise. Some neighbors muttered, others rolled their eyes. A few whispered, no one clapped. Karen approached the microphone and gave it two short taps like she was tuning up for a concert. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice a sugary blend of condescension and faux concern. "I know there's been a lot of confusion and hysteria about the recent vehicle incident." Someone at the back let out a dry laugh. Karen ignored it. She continued, spinning the same tired narrative about safety, abandoned vehicles, visual integrity, and her sacred duty to uphold neighborhood standards. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said. The vehicle in question had not moved in over a week. It was unregistered, unsightly, and chained to the curb like a junkyard ornament. I acted, as always, with the neighborhood's best interests at heart. I stood. I didn't plan to, but I couldn't stay quiet. "That vehicle was part of a federal surveillance operation," I said, loud enough that heads turned. "You cut the lock off and had it towed to a secret lot behind the maintenance shed. You bragged about it on Facebook. This wasn't community safety. This was ego." Murmurs filled the room. Karen's eyes locked onto me like twin lasers. "That's a serious accusation," she said tightly. "It's not an accusation. It's fact." I turned to the AV guy who had been standing near the projector, clearly anticipating this moment. "Run it." The screen flickered to life. First came the ring cam footage. Karen, bold as brass, bolt cutters in hand, walking up to the Jeep and slicing through the wheel lock like it was ribbon on a Christmas present. Her face as she smirked, into the camera was damning enough. Then the tow truck, clearly not city-affiliated, backing up and dragging the Jeep away. Karen standing by, laughing. The room went dead silent. Next came the screenshots. Karen's community Facebook posts, dripping with smug bravado. Sometimes you have to break the rules to keep the streets clean. Soldier Boy can cry all he wants. This is a neighborhood, not a base. If I wanted to live next to a tank, I'd enlist. Each one hit harder than the last. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Greg leaned over to the secretary, whispered something, then straightened and cleared his throat. I'd like to make a motion, he said, barely above a whisper, to suspend Linda Farthington from her position as HOA president, pending internal investigation and legal review. Seconded, someone said almost instantly. All in favor. Came another voice. Hands went up around the room. A few people actually clapped. Karen stood frozen at the podium, blinking like she was watching her reign dissolve in real time. You can't do this, she snapped. This is a power grab. I built this HOA, I maintained this community, and You wrecked it in one afternoon, I replied evenly. Karen shuffled through her clipboard like a flustered magician reaching for a last trick, and then she pulled out a letter, her grand finale. This is a cease and desist order filed by my attorney, she announced, against Mr. Jacobs, the local police department, and the HOA board for defamation, entrapment, and emotional distress. You'll all be hearing from my legal team. Right on cue, Detective Sasha Lynn stepped forward from the side of the room, folder in hand. Your attorney, Trent Maxwell, she asked calmly. We're familiar. He's already under investigation in 3 other HOA lawsuits. Karen faltered, the color draining from her cheeks. Sasha continued. We've reviewed the bylaws, the removal procedures, and the HOA charter. Not only did you bypass your board, but you failed to file any notice, used an unlicensed towing company, relocated a government asset to a non-approved location, and compromised a federal operation. That's not HOA enforcement. That's obstruction. Another beat of stunned silence. And then someone in the crowd whispered, "Get the cupcakes." When the sun rose over Willow Creek Estates after the explosive HOA meeting, it wasn't just another morning. It felt like the curtain lifting on a theater of vindication. People peeked out of windows with new purpose. Whispers circulated in driveways and chat threads alike. Karen had been publicly exposed, yet that was only the beginning. The real action was yet to come. A couple of days later, Officer Melendez and Detective Sasha Lynn invited me to City Hall. We found more things, Sasha said quietly, sliding a thick binder across the table. Inside were receipts, fake invoices, unauthorized towing fees, replacement mulch charges, and suspicious contractor payments drawn straight from HOA funds. They're calling this embezzlement, abuse of authority, wire fraud, Sasha explained. The Jeep was the first step in unlocking a whole house of financial tricks. I studied the pile of papers, realizing that what started as petty enforcement had snowballed into large-scale misappropriation. 2 mornings later, we gathered at precisely 9:06 a.m. A small convoy of federal vehicles and unmarked SUVs rolled into the neighborhood, cordoned off a quiet cul-de-sac, and brought with them a crew of marshals, detectives, and evidence specialists. Neighbors lined the street, clutching coffee and cameras. Rick even brought a vintage boombox playing dramatic instrumental music, the perfect soundtrack for what played out next. After knocking and waiting, a locksmith quietly unlatched Karen's front door. She emerged, shocked, clutching her clipboard, as though it were armor. "We have a warrant," one marshal announced. "Stay calm and put your hands behind your back." She complied stoically. No tears, no screams, just the sinking realization that her reign had ended. Then, community cheers broke out, spontaneous and joyous. Some neighbors cried, others laughed. One elderly couple hugged me and said thank you. Rick set off a tiny firework from the driveway, blue and red sparks signifying public reset. By the next week, the HOA board had unraveled. Greg, bruised but resolute, pushed for community-wide votes. One by one, the HOA was dissolved, violations and fines, nullified rulebooks, and bylaws burned ceremonially in Rick's backyard fire pit. That weekend, we held an impromptu barbecue. No permits, no ribbons. Just neighbors united on their own terms. Then, Sasha and Melendez surprised me later that day with a set of keys. "That impound lot behind the maintenance shed belongs to you now." In one of the most ironic turns ever, the site of Karen's secret vehicle dumping became the site of a new community garage volunteer-run two-lender, open to all, no fees. 3 weeks after Karen's arrest, neighbors organized a silent parade. Jeeps, patrol cars, even vintage Chevy trucks cruised slowly down the cul-de-sac, led by my revived tactical Jeep, upgraded, shining, and bearing the stencil. Community watchdog children waved flags. Veteran neighbors saluted. Sasha gave a short speech, handing me the community plaque for preserving our peace. The gesture was heartfelt. The crowd cheered. Meanwhile, Karen's legal woes became public. Outstanding charges of obstruction, misusing federal property, illegal towing, and embezzlement. Though she pleaded no contest and that yet prison-bound, she was banned from HOA rolls for 20 years, ordered to pay thousands in restitution, and ridiculed online for months. She quietly sold her home, moved away. No farewell, no sympathy. Months later the neighborhood felt different. Front lawns bloomed with personal flair. Mailboxes bore quirky flags. Kids drew in chalk rainbows, superheroes, Jeep logos. Rick's website, HOAdog.net, became a resources hub for others battling HOA overreach. I left the original Jeep parked, just where Karen had first objected, front and center. A warm breeze stirred its stencil. I smiled, knowing that this symbol stood for resilience, community, and the power of standing up. Because sometimes, it's not grand gesture, one Jeep legally parked, that topples the throne of the suburban queen.